What happens when a successful black judge looks at a homeless old man in his courtroom and sees everything he hates about his past? Marcus Williams had built his career on being tough with people like this 70-year-old vagrant who stole a bottle of expensive liquor. "You people disgrace our entire race," the judge said with contempt, ready to deliver his harshest sentence yet. But when the old man lifted his head and spoke just 3 words, the entire courtroom froze in shock. What happened in the next few minutes proved that sometimes the most stunning truths come from those we least expect to hear them from. You know what they say about karma? That woman has a twisted sense of timing. I'm sitting here behind this mahogany bench, black robe draped over my shoulders like some kind of superhero cape, thinking I've got my life figured out. Judge Marcus Williams, 32 years old, youngest appointed judge in Baltimore County's history. The American dream wrapped up in a legal degree and a gavel, right? Wrong as anything I'd ever believed. But let me back up a minute, because the morning this whole mess started, I actually did something decent. Something that would have made my mama proud if she'd been around to notice. I was walking to the courthouse at 7:30 in the morning. Yeah, I'm one of those early birds who believes punctuality is a virtue. When I saw Mrs. Henderson from my old neighborhood struggling with her broken-down Honda in the courthouse parking lot. Now, Mrs. Henderson had been my third-grade teacher back when I was just another scrawny kid from East Baltimore, dreaming of being more than the streets would allow. She'd stayed after school countless times, drilling multiplication tables into my head when other teachers had already written me off as another statistic. So when I saw her standing there in her Sunday best, looking defeated by a car that was older than some of my law clerks, I didn't hesitate. "Mrs. Henderson," I called out, jogging over in my expensive suit. "What's the trouble?" Her face lit up when she recognized me. "Marcus, oh my goodness, look at you!" She gestured at my judicial robes. "I always knew you'd make something of yourself, baby." The car wouldn't start. Dead battery probably hadn't been replaced since the Clinton administration. Mrs. Henderson was late for her own court appearance. Some landlord dispute that had been dragging on for months. In that moment, seeing this woman who'd believed in me when nobody else would, standing there worried sick about missing her court date, I made a decision that felt right in my soul. I called my bailiff and rescheduled my entire morning docket. Then I drove Mrs. Henderson to her hearing myself, waited 3 hours while she dealt with her housing situation, and made sure she got home safely. Cost me a full day of court time, earned me a lecture from the chief judge about maintaining professional boundaries. But I slept good that night. Funny thing about doing the right thing, sometimes the universe decides to test whether you really mean it. The very next morning, I was back in my courtroom, ready to tackle a routine day of petty crimes and municipal violations. That's when they brought him in. Thomas Jackson, the paperwork said, 70 years old, arrested for shoplifting a bottle of expensive liquor from Patterson's Market. The moment he shuffled into my courtroom, I felt my jaw tighten. Here was everything I'd fought my whole life not to become. A broken-down old black man who'd given up on himself, giving the rest of us a bad name. He looked like he'd been sleeping rough for months. His clothes hung off his frame like he'd borrowed them from a bigger man, and that distinctive smell of the streets, unwashed skin mixed with desperation, preceded him like a warning. His hair was gray and matted, his shoes held together with duct tape, and he moved with the careful, measured steps of someone whose pride had been beaten down by life's relentless disappointments. I'd seen 1,000 men like him. Heck, I'd grown up around them. They were the reason I'd studied 18 hours a day through college, the reason I'd worked 3 jobs through law school, the reason I'd clawed my way out of East Baltimore with blood under my fingernails and fire in my belly. I wasn't about to let some old vagrant make a mockery of my courtroom. The arresting officer, a red-faced Irish cop named O'Brien, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, read the charges with barely concealed disgust. Defendant was observed by store employee Janet Morrison removing a bottle of expensive cognac from the shelf and concealing it in his jacket. When confronted, he attempted to flee the premises. I glanced at the witness statement. Janet Morrison, 43, store manager. Her testimony made my blood boil for all the wrong reasons. I saw this black vagrant lurking around the liquor section, acting suspicious. You know how they get when they're looking to steal something. I called the police immediately and personally detained him until they arrived. The casual racism in her statement should have angered me on behalf of the defendant. Instead, it just reminded me why I'd worked so hard to distance myself from everything this old man represented. Every time someone like him got arrested, it reinforced every stereotype, every prejudice, every reason people had to look at successful black men like me with suspicion. "Mr. Jackson," I said, my voice carrying the weight of 32 years of accumulated frustration, "you're charged with theft of property valued at $47. How do you plead?" He stood slowly, his weathered hands gripping the defendant's table. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, a flash of intelligence that seemed at odds with his circumstances. But I was too irritated to pay attention. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected dignity. That's when I lost it. "Guilty," I repeated, shaking my head with undisguised contempt. Just like that. No excuse, no sob story about how hard life has been. At least you're honest about being a thief. The courtroom fell silent. Even my court reporter looked up from her machine, surprised by the harshness in my tone. But I was on a roll, years of pent-up frustration pouring out like water through a broken dam. "Tell me something, Mr. Jackson," I continued, leaning forward on the bench. "What's your story? Did you wake up one morning and decide that stealing was easier than working? Or did you just never bother trying to make something of yourself in the first place?" The old man's eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw something that made me uncomfortable. Not shame or anger, but something that looked almost like disappointment. "Some of us," he said slowly, "have carried burdens you couldn't imagine, young man." "Young man," I snorted. "I'm a federal judge, not some kid you can lecture about life, and save your burden speech for someone who cares. I grew up in the same neighborhoods as you, probably worse. The difference is, I decided to do something about it instead of drowning my problems in self-pity." That's when he said it. 3 words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my life, my past, and the man is staring back at me from the defendant's table. "You're my son." The words hit the courtroom like a physical force. I felt the air get sucked out of the room, felt every pair of eyes turn toward me, felt my carefully constructed world begin to crumble. The gavel slipped from my hand and clattered onto the bench, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom like a gunshot. "What did you just say?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Thomas Jackson straightened up, and suddenly his shabby appearance seemed less important than the unmistakable intelligence burning in his dark eyes. "You heard me correctly, Marcus. You're my son, my boy, the child I lost 27 years ago." The courtroom erupted. Spectators turned to each other with excited whispers. Court reporters scrambled to capture every word, and I felt my entire reality shift beneath me like sand. "That's impossible," I managed to choke out. "My father is dead. He died when I was 5. My mother told me—" "Your mother told you what she needed you to believe," Thomas interrupted gently. "But I'm very much alive, son. I've been looking for you for more years than you can imagine." My mind raced backward through 27 years of carefully constructed lies. The heroic father who died serving his community. The tragic young widow struggling to raise her son alone. The bedtime stories about a man whose integrity and dedication to justice had inspired my entire career. All fabrication. Every last word of it. What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about family, justice, and the thin line between the two. You won't want to miss how this story unfolds. Chapter 2. The Weight of Truth. Let me tell you something about having your entire life revealed as a lie in front of a room full of strangers. It's not the kind of experience they prepare you for in law school. I sat there behind that bench, staring at this broken-down old man who claimed to be my father, feeling like someone had just pulled the rug out from under everything I'd ever believed about myself. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I could feel dozens of eyes boring into me, waiting for my response, waiting to see how Judge Marcus Williams would handle having his personal business aired out like dirty laundry on a Tuesday morning. But here's the thing about shock. It doesn't last long before it transforms into something else. In my case, that something else was pure, undiluted rage. "Bailiff," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, considering my hands were shaking like leaves in a hurricane. "Clear the courtroom. This court is in recess." "Your Honor," the prosecutor started to object. "We have other cases on the docket." "I said clear the courtroom," I shouted, my composure finally cracking. "Now!" As people filed out in confused whispers and hurried footsteps, I kept my eyes locked on Thomas Jackson. He stood there calmly, watching me with an expression that was part sorrow, part hope, and part something I couldn't quite identify. When the last spectator had left and only the court officers remained, I finally spoke. "You want to talk?" "Fine, but not here. Not like this." I pointed toward my chambers. "In there. And this better not be some con game, old man, because I promise you—" "It's not a game, Marcus," he said quietly. "I wish to goodness it was." Thomas's perspective, sitting in that defendant's chair, watching my son's face contort with anger and disbelief, I wondered if I'd made the biggest mistake of my 70 years on this earth. The boy, no, the man staring down at me with such contempt wasn't the child I'd lost all those years ago. This was someone hardened by life, someone who'd built walls around his heart that seemed thicker than the courthouse walls surrounding us. Had I been wrong about him? Had his mother's influence shaped him so thoroughly that he'd become the kind of man who could look at an old black vagrant and see nothing but trash to be swept away? The way he'd spoken to me before revealing myself. Lord, the coldness in his voice, like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe. But then I reminded myself why I was here. I'd read about his appointment to the bench in the Baltimore Sun 3 months ago. Youngest federal judge in county history, the headline had proclaimed, above a photograph that had stopped my heart cold. Those were my eyes staring back at me from that newspaper. My jaw, my stubborn chin, even the way he held his head when he was thinking hard about something. 27 years I'd been searching, following cold leads and dead ends, hiring private investigators when I could afford them, making calls to social services offices across 3 states. And there he was, 2 hours away from where I'd been living all along, dispensing justice from behind a bench just like his old man. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a sitting judge myself, dressed like a common criminal, about to test whether my own son had inherited any of my principles or just his mother's willingness to bend the rules when it suited her. But watching him now, seeing the disgust and anger in his expression, I couldn't help but wonder. What if he sentences me? What if this test I'd devised backfires spectacularly? What if my own son, my own flesh and blood, decides that Thomas Jackson the vagrant deserves the full weight of the law? Biological connection be darned. Part of me hoped he would. Part of me hoped that somewhere underneath all that hardness, all that cold judicial authority, there was still a man who believed that justice was blind, even when it was staring at its own father across a courtroom. My chambers felt smaller than usual, with Thomas Jackson sitting across from my desk. I dismissed the bailiff and locked the door, needing privacy for whatever conversation was about to unfold. The old man sat quietly, his hands folded in his lap, waiting for me to make the first move. I wasn't sure where to start. How do you begin a conversation with someone who claims to be the father you thought was dead? How do you process the possibility that your entire childhood was built on lies? "Prove it," I said finally, my voice harder than I intended. "If you're really my father, prove it." Thomas nodded as if he'd been expecting this. "You have a birthmark behind your left ear, shaped like a crescent moon. You got it from me. I have the same one. You're left-handed even though your mother tried to force you to write with your right hand when you were little. You were born at University Hospital at 3:17 in the morning on October 15th, 1991, weighing 6 pounds, 4 ounces. My hand instinctively went to the mark behind my ear, hidden by my hair. The birthmark I'd never told anyone about. The one that had embarrassed me as a kid because other children said it looked weird. "That doesn't prove anything," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "You could have gotten that information anywhere." Thomas reached into his jacket, carefully aware that sudden movements might alarm me, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a photograph that looked like it had been handled thousands of times over the years. He placed it on my desk. It was a picture of a baby, maybe 6 months old, sitting in a high chair with food smeared across his face. The baby was laughing, one tiny hand reaching toward the camera. But what stopped me cold wasn't the child. It was the man holding him. A younger version of Thomas Jackson, maybe 30 years old, grinning with the kind of joy that only comes from holding your firstborn child. "That's you," Thomas said softly. "6 months old. You just discovered mashed sweet potatoes and you thought it was the funniest thing in the world to rub them in your hair." I stared at the photograph, my throat tight. The resemblance was undeniable, not just between the baby and me, but between the young man in the picture and the broken-down vagrant sitting across from me. What the heck had happened to transform one into the other? "Where have you been?" I asked, the question coming out angrier than I'd intended. "If you're really my father, where have you been for the last 27 years? Thomas flinched at my tone, but his expression remained calm. "Your mother took you away from me when you were 5 years old. Just packed up and disappeared in the middle of the night, taking you with her. By the time I tracked her down, she'd remarried and you had a new father. I thought maybe it was better to leave you alone." "That's ridiculous," I snapped. "You thought it was easier to disappear than to fight for your son? You don't understand the situation. Then explain it." I slammed my hand on the desk, papers scattering. "Explain why my mother told me you were dead. Explain why she spent 27 years lying to me about who my father was. Explain why she said you were some kind of hero when you're sitting here in my courtroom dressed like a vagrant." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with those dark eyes that I was beginning to recognize as familiar. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Your mother and I were young when we met. Too young, probably. She was 19, I was 22, fresh out of law school and full of ideals about justice and doing the right thing. She was beautiful, spirited, and I fell for her harder than a man has any right to fall for anyone." He paused, running a weathered hand through his gray hair. "For a while, we were happy. We had our struggles. Money was tight. I was working long hours trying to establish my career. But we were building something together. Then you came along, and for 5 years, I thought I was the luckiest man alive." "So what happened?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "Your Uncle Jerome happened." The name hit me like a slap. Jerome. My mother's brother. The one she never talked about. The one whose name would make her face darken whenever someone mentioned him at family gatherings. "Jerome got involved with the wrong crowd," Thomas continued. "Theft. Eventually worse things. Your mother always made excuses for him, said he was troubled, said he needed family support, said we couldn't abandon him just because he made mistakes." I could see where this was heading, and my stomach began to churn. "Then one night, Jerome robbed a convenience store. The owner, an elderly Korean man named Mr. Kim, tried to stop him. Jerome panicked and hurt him badly. Mr. Kim died on the way to the hospital, leaving behind a wife and 3 children." Thomas's voice became strained, the weight of old grief evident in every word. "Your mother came to me the night Jerome was arrested. She begged me to help him, said family sticks together no matter what. She wanted me to use my connections, find a way to get the charges reduced, maybe claim it was self-defense or temporary insanity. She said if I really loved her, if I really loved our family, I'd find a way to keep Jerome out of prison." "And you refuse," I said quietly. "I prosecuted that case myself," Thomas said, his voice firm with conviction. "I made sure Jerome got life without parole, because that's what he deserved, because Mr. Kim's family deserved justice, because doing the right thing mattered more than family loyalty." Suddenly, pieces of my childhood started falling into place. My mother's bitterness toward the legal system, her drinking, the way she'd flinch whenever she saw police cars or courthouses, the mysterious Uncle Jerome who was never mentioned, but whose absence seemed to haunt every family gathering. "She left you because you sent her brother to prison," I said. "She took you and disappeared that same night," Thomas confirmed. "Said I'd chosen my precious principles over my own family. Said if I cared more about some dead stranger than about the people I was supposed to love, then I could see how much my principles warmed my bed at night." I sat back in my chair, my head spinning. Everything my mother had told me about my father, every story about his heroic death, every tear she'd shed over his memory, all lies. But why? Why create such an elaborate fiction instead of just telling me the truth? She told me you were a judge too, I said slowly, that you died in a car accident when I was 5. She said you were a good man who believed in justice above all else. Thomas smiled sadly. Well, 2 out of 3 isn't bad. I am a judge, and I do believe in justice above all else. But I'm very much alive, son. I've been alive and looking for you for 27 years. You're a judge? I felt like I'd been hit with another sledgehammer. Where? Circuit Court in Western Maryland. Been on the bench for 15 years now. Before that, I was a prosecutor for 12 years. He reached into his jacket again and pulled out his judicial credentials. Judge Thomas Jackson, 3rd Judicial Circuit. I stared at the identification, feeling like I was looking at my own future reflected back at me. My father was a judge, my real father, not the mythical hero my mother had invented, but a real man who'd made real choices and paid real consequences for them. Why now, I asked. Why reveal yourself now, after all these years? Thomas's expression grew complicated. I saw your appointment announcement in the Baltimore Sun 3 months ago. When I saw your photograph, when I read about your background, Marcus, you look exactly like I did at your age. You chose the same career path I did. You even ended up in Baltimore, not 50 miles from where I've been working all these years. So you decided to track me down. I decided to test you, he said quietly. The words hung in the air between us like a loaded gun. Test me how? Thomas gestured toward his shabby appearance. This isn't how I normally dress, son. I didn't steal that bottle because I needed it. I stole it because I needed to see what kind of man you'd become. I needed to know if you'd inherited your mother's willingness to bend the rules for family, or if maybe, just maybe, you'd gotten something from me. The full magnitude of what he'd done hit me like a freight train. You committed a crime just to see how I'd handle your case? I needed to know if you were the kind of judge who'd let personal feelings cloud his judgment. I needed to know if you'd uphold the law even when it was difficult, even when it cost you something personal. I stared at him in disbelief. You manipulated this entire situation just to test my character? Yes, he said simply. And now I know what kind of man you are. And what kind of man is that? Thomas's eyes were steady as they met mine. You're tough, maybe tougher than you need to be. You're angry, and I suspect you have good reasons for that anger. But you're fair. You believe in justice, even when it's inconvenient, even when it hurts. I felt tears stinging my eyes, a combination of rage and relief, and 27 years of questions finally getting answers. You tested me, I repeated. You actually tested me. And you passed, Thomas said gently. The way you handled my case before you knew who I was? Harsh, yes, but within the bounds of the law. You didn't let sympathy or racism or any other factor compromise your judgment. You saw a man who'd committed a crime, and you prepared to sentence him accordingly. I could still sentence you, I said, my voice harder than I felt. Did you think about that? Did you think I'd just let you walk away because you're my father? Thomas nodded slowly. That's exactly what I'm hoping you'll do. Sentence me according to the law. Show me that you're the man I always hoped you'd become. I stared at him across the desk, this stranger who claimed to be my father, this man who'd abandoned me and my mother, and then had the audacity to test my character when he finally decided to reappear. The smart thing would be to recuse myself, let another judge handle the case. The emotional thing would be to either dismiss the charges or throw the book at him. But what was the right thing? This is the climax. Everything you've been waiting for, the choice that will define both father and son, is about to unfold. Stay with me to see how Marcus handles the most important decision of his judicial career. Chapter 3. The verdict that changes everything. Walking back into that courtroom felt like walking to my own execution. Every step echoed through the empty hallway, my judicial robes feeling heavier than they ever had before. Thomas, I couldn't bring myself to call him father yet, walked beside me in silence, his weathered face showing no trace of anxiety about what was to come. The courtroom had filled up again while we were in chambers. Word travels fast in a courthouse, especially when it involves a judge and a family secret that's more dramatic than a soap opera. Reporters sat in the front rows, their notebooks ready, their cameras trained on the bench. Court officers lined the walls, probably wondering if they'd need to intervene if things got ugly. I took my seat behind the bench and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. Everyone wanted to see how this would play out. Would Judge Marcus Williams show mercy to his long-lost father? Would family loyalty trump judicial duty? Would this be the kind of courthouse drama that would make headlines for weeks? They were about to find out that life isn't a fairy tale. The court calls the case of State versus Thomas Jackson, I announced, my voice carrying clearly through the room. Defendant, please stand. Thomas rose slowly, his dignity intact despite his shabby appearance. For a moment I saw not the vagrant who'd shuffled into my courtroom that morning, but the man in the photograph, younger, hopeful, holding his baby son with infinite tenderness. Then I remembered 27 years of lies. 27 years of wondering about a father who was supposedly dead. 27 years of my mother's carefully constructed mythology. The anger came flooding back, hot and bitter in my throat. Mr. Jackson, I began, my voice formal and cold. You've entered a guilty plea to charges of theft in the 4th degree, shoplifting merchandise valued at $47. Before I pass sentence, do you have anything to say to this court? Thomas met my eyes directly, and I saw something there that surprised me. Pride. Not defiance or pleading or shame, but genuine pride. Pride in me, in the man I'd become, in the choice he knew I was about to make. Your Honor, he said quietly, I committed the crime I'm charged with. I knew the consequences when I did it, and I accept full responsibility for my actions. I have no excuses to offer this court. A murmur ran through the gallery. Everyone had expected some kind of emotional appeal, some plea for leniency based on our newfound relationship. Instead, Thomas had given them the kind of straight answer that judges dream of hearing. No sob story, no manipulation, just a man owning his choices, which perversely made what I had to do next even harder. Mr. Jackson, I continued, theft in the 4th degree is a misdemeanor offense in this state, punishable by up to 90 days in county jail and a fine of up to $1,000. I paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the courtroom. Thomas stood perfectly still, his shoulders straight, waiting for my decision. Therefore, I announced, my voice cutting through the whispers like a blade, this court sentences you to 30 days in the county jail, with credit for time served and work release privileges. The courtroom erupted. Reporters scribbled frantically. Spectators turned to each other in shock, and I saw more than one person shake their head in disbelief. Thomas Jackson's own son had just sentenced him to jail time, but Thomas himself didn't flinch. If anything, his expression grew softer, more peaceful, as if I'd just given him exactly what he'd been hoping for. Additionally, I continued over the noise, the court recommends that you be connected with social services for employment assistance and housing support upon your release. I brought my gavel down hard, the sound echoing through the chaos. This court is adjourned. As the bailiff moved to take Thomas into custody, he caught my eye one last time. Thank you, he mouthed silently, and I saw tears glistening in those eyes that were so much like my own. I watched them lead him away. This stranger who was my father, this man who'd tested me and found me worthy even as I sent him to jail. The irony wasn't lost on me. In 27 years of wondering about my father, I'd never imagined that our reunion would involve me putting him behind bars. But as I sat there in the empty courtroom, surrounded by the lingering echoes of shocked whispers and frantically typing reporters, I realized something profound. Thomas Jackson had gotten exactly what he'd come for. He'd wanted to know what kind of man his son had become, and I'd just shown him. 3 weeks later, I found myself in an unfamiliar place, the visitor's room at Baltimore County Jail. When Thomas walked in, wearing his orange jumpsuit, he looked different. Not just because of the uniform, but because he carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man at peace with his choices. You came, he said simply as he sat down across from me. I said I would. We talked for hours that first visit, about his career as a judge, about the choices that had led to our separation, about the man I'd become, and the relationship we might be able to build. It wasn't easy. 27 years of hurt doesn't disappear overnight, but it was a beginning. Over the following weeks, I visited regularly. We shared stories, compared our experiences on the bench, and slowly began to understand each other. When Thomas was released after serving his full sentence, I was there to meet him. The months that followed were filled with careful steps toward reconciliation. Thomas met my wife Sarah and our two young children. He attended family dinners, helped with homework, and gradually became the grandfather my children had never known they were missing. On a warm Sunday evening, 6 months after his release, we sat on my back porch watching my kids play in the yard. Thomas had cleaned up well, traded his vagrant costume for the simple dignity of a retired judge. He was telling my 5-year-old daughter, Emma, about the time her daddy had eaten an entire jar of baby food sweet potatoes as a toddler. "Grandpa Thomas," Emma giggled, "Daddy was a messy baby." I watched my father, and yes, I could finally call him that, smile at my daughter with the same joy I'd seen in that old photograph. The same joy I'd been denied for 27 years, but was grateful to witness now. "He was the most beautiful, messy baby in the world," Thomas told her, his eyes finding mine across the yard. That evening, after the kids were in bed and Sarah had gone inside to clean up, Thomas and I remained on the porch. The crickets were singing, and the air carried the scent of Sarah's roses. "I never thanked you," I said quietly. "For what?" "For the test, for making me prove who I was before you accepted me as your son." Thomas nodded slowly. "And I never thanked you for passing it, for showing me that somewhere in all those years apart, despite everything, you became exactly the kind of man I hoped you'd be." We sat in comfortable silence, two judges who'd found their way back to being father and son. The sound of my children's laughter drifted from their bedroom windows, and I realized that the greatest verdict I'd ever rendered wasn't in that courtroom 3 months ago. It was this: choosing to build a future with the father I'd thought I'd lost, surrounded by the family we were both blessed to call home.